You need to leave right now before I call the police. David Collins pointed at the door. His voice didn't waver. His finger didn't shake. And Emma Carter, standing behind the counter with an empty coffee pot in her hand, looked at her manager and felt something crack open inside her chest, not from fear but from the sheer breathtaking disbelief that this was actually happening. She had given a man a glass of water. That was it. That was the whole crime. Stay. Before we go any further, if you're watching this right now, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because this story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Drop a comment and tell me what city you were watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Golden Road Diner sat at the edge of Silver Creek, Arizona, the way most things in desert towns sit, stubborn, weathered, and slightly apologetic about still being there. It had seen better decades. The vinyl booths had been patched so many times that the patches had patches. The overhead lights hummed a constant low note that nobody who worked there could hear anymore because they'd stopped noticing it somewhere around their second month on the job. The coffee was decent. The pie was better than decent. And Emma Carter, 25 years old, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, was the reason most of the regulars came back. Not for the pie, for her. She had worked at the Golden Road for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had memorized the order of every regular who walked through the door before they sat down. She knew that old Gerald Hutchins took his coffee with 2 sugars and always asked for decaf, but never actually wanted decaf. She knew that the Martinez family came in every Saturday, and that their youngest, a 7-year-old named Rosa, would want a grilled cheese but would ultimately eat half of her mother's pancakes instead. She knew that the long-haul truckers who stopped in around 4 in the morning needed more than coffee. They needed someone to make eye contact with them, and mean it, needed someone to ask how the drive was going and actually wait for the answer. Emma was that person. She had become that person not because someone trained her to be, not because the employee handbook said anything about genuine human warmth, but because she understood something in her bones that a lot of people in this world forget somewhere between childhood and adulthood, that every single person who walks through a door is carrying something invisible, and most of them are hoping that just once somebody will notice the weight. She knew about invisible weight. She had been carrying her own for 2 years. Her brother Jake was 22. He had been 20 when the accident happened, a construction site, a scaffold that wasn't bolted the way it was supposed to be bolted, and 30 feet of air between him and the ground. He survived. Barely. He came out of it with 2 surgeries behind him, a third one pending, a left leg that would never work the way it used to, and medical bills that arrived in the mailbox like clockwork, each one politely informing Emma that the amount owed had increased again due to interest accrual. Their parents were gone, their father first, their mother 3 years after that. Jake was all Emma had, and Emma was all Jake had, and so Emma woke up every morning at 4:30 to be at the diner by 5, and she worked doubles on Thursdays and Fridays, and she smiled at every customer, and she carried the invisible weight, and she did not ask for sympathy because sympathy didn't pay Jake's physical therapy bills. That was the life she was living on the morning William Walker walked through the door. It was a Tuesday in early November, the kind of cold that southern Arizona rarely gets, but hits harder when it does because nobody's prepared for it. Emma had been on her feet for 4 hours already. The breakfast rush was tapering off. She was refilling the napkin dispensers at the counter when she heard the bell above the door and looked up out of habit. The man who walked in was large. Not threatening large, just the kind of large that comes from a lifetime of physical work and outdoor living. He was somewhere in his early 60s with a gray beard that had grown past the point of being groomed and into the point of being simply part of his face. His leather vest was weathered to the point where you couldn't tell what color it had originally been. The patches on it were various, some faded, some bright, and the largest one across the back read Hell's Angels in letters that most people in that diner recognized before they recognized anything else about him. The reaction was immediate and wordless. The 2 women in the corner booth angled their bodies slightly away. The man sitting at the counter eating his eggs shifted his stool 2 inches without looking up. The cook through the pass-through window, whose name was Terry, and who had worked at the diner for 11 years, glanced out and then very deliberately looked back down at his grill. Emma saw all of this happen in about 4 seconds. Then she looked at the man again. Past the vest, past the beard, past the letters on his back, and what she saw was that he was moving wrong. Not in a dangerous way, in a hurting way. He was favoring his right side in the careful compensating way that people do when something on their left side has been damaged and they've stopped trusting it. His face under the beard was tight, not angry tight, pain tight. There was a difference, and Emma had learned it from watching her brother navigate the world after his accident, the set of the jaw, the careful control of the eyes, the deliberateness of every movement. This man was in pain. He was also, she noticed, as he stood uncertainly near the hostess stand, looking at the room, the way people look at rooms when they're trying to figure out whether they're welcome in it. Emma set down the napkin holder she was holding and walked out from behind the counter. She walked directly toward him. She didn't slow down. She didn't take the indirect route that would have let her pretend she was going somewhere else. She walked straight to him, and she said in her normal voice, the same voice she used with Gerald Hutchins and the Martinez family and the 4 in the Morning truckers. "Hey there, just you today." The man looked at her. He had pale blue eyes that had seen a considerable amount of the world and had come out the other side of most of it intact. He said, "Just me," and his voice was rough in the way that voices get rough when they haven't been used much in the past several hours. Emma said, "Boy, I've got a good spot at the end of the counter. Quieter down there. You doing okay getting around, or do you need a booth?" Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, just slightly, like a door opening a crack. "Counter's fine," he said. She walked him to the stool at the far end, the one closest to the window and farthest from the knot of other customers, and she set a menu in front of him, even though she could already tell by looking at him that he wasn't in a condition to make careful food choices. She poured him a glass of water from the pitcher she was carrying and set it in front of him first before anything else because he looked like a man who needed water immediately. He picked it up with both hands and drank half of it in one movement. "Thank you," he said. "Take your time with the menu," Emma said. "There's no rush." She walked back behind the counter and began making coffee. David Collins appeared at the service window 3 minutes later. David was 38 years old and had been managing the Golden Road Diner for 4 years. He was the kind of manager who cared enormously about things like table turnover rates and the proper positioning of salt shakers and the specific corporate-approved greeting that employees were supposed to use when customers entered. He had a framed certificate on the wall of his office from a regional restaurant management seminar he had attended in Phoenix 2 years ago. He referenced it in conversations more often than the situation generally called for. He was staring at Emma. "What are you doing?" he said quietly, but with a specific quality to the quiet that meant he was not actually being quiet. He was being controlled, and the control was doing significant work. Emma said without stopping what she was doing, taking care of a customer. "That customer," David said, "is a Hell's Angel. He's a person who came in for breakfast," Emma said. "Emma," David's voice dropped another register. "You walked up to him, unprompted. You brought him to the counter." "He was standing at the hostess station," Emma said. "That's what the hostess station is for. I want you to tell him we're at capacity." Emma stopped what she was doing. She set down the coffee pot. She turned and looked at David directly. "We're not at capacity," she said. "Emma, David, there are 4 people in this diner. We seat 42. I'm not going to tell a man we're full when I can see empty booths from here." David's jaw tightened. "This is about image. This is about how other customers feel when what?" Emma said. Her voice stayed even. That was important. She had learned a long time ago that when you needed people to actually hear what you were saying, you kept your voice even. When they see us treating everyone who comes in the same way, when they see us doing the job we're supposed to be doing. "You don't understand how this works," David said. "I think I do," Emma said. "I've been doing it for 3 years." She picked up the coffee pot and walked back to the counter. The man, she didn't know his name yet, wouldn't know it for another 20 minutes, was still looking at the menu, holding it at the angle that people hold things when their hands aren't quite steady. Emma poured his coffee without being asked because she could see from 6 feet away that he needed it. She said, "The biscuits and gravy are really good today. Terry makes them from scratch on Tuesdays." She paused. "The egg scramble's also good if you need something with protein. Or if you just want something simple, we can do plain eggs any way you want them." The man set the menu down. He looked at her steadily. "Scrambled," he said, "and more water when you get a chance." "Already on it," Emma said, and refilled his glass before she walked back to put the order in. She was aware, with the particular peripheral awareness that experienced waitresses develop, that David was still watching from the service window. She was also aware that he was not going to let this go. She had worked for David long enough to know the specific texture of his silences, and this one had an edge to it that meant he was calculating rather than cooling down. The food came out in 8 minutes. Emma set it in front of the man and he looked at it for a moment in the way that people look at things they need very badly, but have been doing without for long enough that the sight of them produces something complicated. He picked up his fork. He ate in silence for a few minutes. Then he said without looking up, "People moved away from me when I walked in." Emma didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. She said, "Some people do." "You didn't." "No," she said. He looked up then. He had a direct way of looking at people that probably unnerved a lot of people, but that Emma found oddly easier than the indirect way most people looked at each other. He said, "Why not?" Emma considered the question. She didn't want to give him a speech. She said, "Because you look like you needed a cup of coffee more than you needed me to be nervous about you." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something happened to the lines around his eyes that, if you were paying attention, you might have called the beginning of a smile. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to eating. His name, she learned, was William Walker. He told her this when she refilled his coffee for the third time, which she did because he drank it steadily and with the focused appreciation of someone who had gone too long without it. He said people called him Iron, had called him that since his early 30s, and when she asked where he was headed, he said he was coming from Flagstaff and going to Tucson, and that he'd had a rough couple of days on the road. "Rough like bad weather, rough or rough like something else," Emma said. He looked at her sideways. "Something else," he said. She didn't press. She topped off his coffee and moved down the counter to check on the 2 other customers who had come in during the past 20 minutes. And when she came back, he was sitting more upright than he'd been when he walked in, and some of the tightness had left his face. She was thinking about whether he might want pie when David appeared at her elbow. He had come out from the back. He wasn't at the service window anymore. He was standing beside her in the narrow space behind the counter, and his voice was very low and very flat, and he said, "I need you to give him the check and clear the stool." Emma said, "He's still eating. I want him done and out in the next 5 minutes." Emma said, "I'm not going to rush him out." David said, "This isn't a request." Emma turned and looked at him. He was shorter than her by about an inch, and he squared his shoulders when he was trying to compensate for that which he was doing now. She said, "David, he's a paying customer who's been polite and quiet and hasn't done anything wrong. I'm not going to make him feel unwelcome because of what he's wearing. You don't get to decide." "Actually," Emma said quietly, "in the moment I'm standing here, I do. Because I'm the one he's talking to. And I'm the one who has to look at him and say the words, and I won't say words that aren't true." She moved to go back to the counter. David caught her arm. Not hard, but he caught it. She stopped. She turned and looked at his hand on her arm, and then she looked at his face and she waited. He let go. His face had gone a particular shade that she'd seen before on men who weren't used to not getting what they wanted and were working out in real time how to respond. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," Emma said, "but it'll be mine." She walked back to the counter. William Walker was watching. He'd seen the exchange, she was sure of it, because he was a man who had spent decades watching rooms. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She refilled his water and asked if he wanted to see the pie menu. "What kind do you have?" he said. "Apple cherry, and today Terry made a pecan. That's honestly probably the best thing on the menu." He considered this. "Pecan," he said. She put in the order. She was behind the counter cutting the slice herself because Terry had gone on break when David came back. This time he didn't come to the service window, and he didn't come to stand beside her. He came to stand directly in front of her on the customer side of the counter, and he said loudly enough that the people in the nearest booth could hear, "Emma, a word, in the back, now." William Walker looked up from his coffee. Emma set down the pie server. She looked at David. She said at normal conversational volume, "I'll be back in a minute," to the general vicinity of the counter, picked up the plate with the pie on it, walked to the end of the counter, set it in front of William Walker, said, "Enjoy," and then walked toward the back. She heard very clearly as she walked William Walker say to nobody in particular, "Good pie, I bet." The back office of the Golden Road Diner was 8 feet by 10 feet and contained a desk, a filing cabinet, a chair that David sat in, and 2 chairs that other people sat in when David needed them to sit in chairs, and the framed certificate from the restaurant management seminar. Emma stood in the room and waited. David closed the door. He stood behind his desk. He said, I'm going to ask you one more time to apologize to me for what happened out there and to agree that you will follow my direction when I give you direction in the future. Emma said, I'm not going to apologize for how I treated a customer. I'm not asking you about the customer, David said. I'm asking you about your attitude toward me. My attitude, Emma said, is that I disagreed with you. If that's what we're calling an attitude problem, then yes, I have one. This diner has a reputation, David said. This diner has regular customers who have expectations about the kind of establishment this is. When someone walks in, Emma said, they're a customer. That's the whole sentence. There's no what they're wearing at the end of it. David stared at her. Emma stared back. A person doesn't become less human because they look different from you, she said. And I'm not going to pretend that they do. Something happened to David's face in that moment. It was brief and complicated, a flash of something that might have been under different circumstances. Something like recognition, something almost like shame. But it was gone, almost immediately replaced by the flat, deliberate expression of someone who has decided that backing down is not an option they're willing to consider. He said, you're done here. Emma heard the words. She let them sit for a second. She said, you're firing me. I'm terminating your employment, yes. For giving a customer a glass of water. For insubordination and failure to follow the management direction. Emma looked at him for a long moment. The office was very small and very quiet. Outside through the thin wall, she could hear the distant sound of the diner, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the perpetual background hum of the overhead lights that nobody who worked there could hear anymore. She said, okay. She said it calmly, the way she said most things, because there was a kind of pride in her that didn't allow her to fall apart in front of people who had decided to be unkind to her. There was time for that later. There was always time for that later. She took off her apron. She set it on the corner of David's desk. She said, you'll mail my last check. It wasn't a question. She walked out of the office. She walked through the back of the diner, and she did not look at the kitchen because she didn't want to see Terry looking at her with that expression people have when they witness something bad happen and didn't stop it, because she understood why people didn't stop things, and she didn't have the emotional energy to forgive anyone right now. She walked through the door to the customer area, and she slowed for just a second because William Walker was still at the counter, and he had turned on his stool, and he was watching her with those pale blue eyes. She stopped. She said, it was nice meeting you. He looked at her. He said, what happened? She said, I'm not working here anymore. He said, because of me. She said, because of a decision I made. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, what's your name? Emma, she said. Emma Carter. He said, William Walker. He held out his hand across the counter. She shook it. His hand was large and rough and cold from the water glass. He said, I'm sorry, Emma. Don't be, she said. I'd do it again. She picked up her jacket from the hook by the service station. She walked to the front door. She pushed it open into the cold November air, and she stood there for a moment on the concrete outside the Golden Road Diner jacket, in her hands the door swinging shut behind her, and she let herself feel for exactly 3 seconds the full weight of what had just happened. 3 seconds of allowing the reality to arrive. No job, no paycheck. Jake's bills, the mortgage payment that was due in 11 days, the third surgery that was still not fully funded. The fact that she had just made a catastrophically expensive choice in the name of something she couldn't even fully articulate except as this is just what you do when someone needs help. 3 seconds. Then she put her jacket on and walked to her car. She didn't know, sitting in that car in the parking lot of a diner that had just fired her for choosing decency over compliance, that the man she had treated like a human being was sitting at the counter watching her car. She didn't know that he was pulling out a phone that was older than most of the phones in that parking lot and calling a number he had memorized rather than stored. She didn't know what he said into that phone or who he said it to. She didn't know any of that. She turned the key in the ignition and drove home. She had numbers to recalculate. The table at home had always been her place of reckoning, the small kitchen table with the uneven leg that wobbled unless you put a folded piece of cardboard under it, the table where she spread out bills and statements and did the math that never quite worked out, and then figured out a way to make it work out anyway. She sat down at that table with a legal pad and a pen, and she did what she always did when the world shifted under her. She wrote down the numbers, and she looked at them, and she figured out the next step. The rent on the small house she shared with Jake, $1,400 a month. Jake's physical therapy, $320 per session twice a week. The pending surgery estimate after insurance, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000, depending on which procedure the surgeon ultimately recommended. Her emergency fund, $1,216. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Jake came in around 11. He moved carefully the way he always did, his left leg still. The unreliable thing it had been since the accident, and he sat down across from her and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are you okay?" I'm figuring it out," she said. He said, "Are you okay?" She looked at her brother. He had her same blonde hair, same blue eyes, same directness that their mother used to call the family curse, and their father used to call the family strength. He was 22 years old, and he had a titanium rod in his femur and bills that kept accumulating, and he still right now was looking at her to see how she was doing before he asked about any of that. "I'm proud of what I did," she said. "I'm scared about what comes next." Both things are true. He nodded. He reached across the table and put his hand on hers briefly in the way that siblings who have been through things together touch each other. Not sentimental, just solid. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." She nodded. She went back to the numbers. She was still at the table 3 hours later when her phone rang. Unknown number. Arizona area code, but not Silver Creek. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it because she had just lost her job, and you didn't not answer calls when you had just lost your job. "Is this Emma Carter?" A man's voice. Deep measured the voice of someone who was used to being listened to. "Yes," she said. "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm a friend of William Walker's. He called me about 2 hours ago and told me what happened this morning." Emma said, "Okay." Marcus said, "He told me you lost your job because you helped him." "I lost my job because my manager made a choice," Emma said. "I'm not looking for anything from—" "I know you're not," Marcus said. "That's actually why I'm calling." A pause, not an uncomfortable one, a deliberate one. "I just wanted you to know that what you did, the way you treated him, it matters to him, to me, to a lot of people." Emma said carefully, "I appreciate you saying that." "I want to ask you something," Marcus said. "Do you have any idea who William Walker is?" Emma said, "He told me his name." Marcus said, "His name, yes, but who he is, what he's been through, the people who know him and have ridden with him and gone to the wall with him. You have any idea about any of that?" Emma said, "No. Does it change anything about what I did?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, that's exactly it. That's the whole thing, Emma. No, it doesn't." After she hung up, she sat at the table with the legal pad and the numbers, and she thought about the call. She wasn't sure what to make of it. She appreciated it. She wasn't sure it changed anything practical about her situation. Her phone rang again 40 minutes later. Different number, different man, calling to say he'd heard what happened and wanted her to know it meant something. And then again, an hour after that. By the time Jake came back into the kitchen to make dinner, Emma had received 6 calls from numbers she didn't recognize, all of them short. All of them variations on the same theme someone heard. "What you did, we wanted you to know. It matters." And she was sitting at the table with the phone in her hand, not looking at the numbers on the legal pad anymore, looking at the phone. "What's going on?" Jake said. "I genuinely don't know," Emma said. She went to bed that night without understanding it. She had taken a man's dignity seriously for the cost of a glass of water and a slice of pecan pie. She had paid for his meal, which she would do the math on later. The total had come to $34, including the pie, which she had charged to her own tab, because she wasn't going to let him pay for a meal in a diner that had treated him poorly, and she had been fired. And now people were calling her to say it mattered. She thought maybe it's just a few people. Maybe they're upset on William's behalf and this will pass in a day or two. She thought, "I need to find another job tomorrow." She thought the surgery fund is still $8,000 short. She turned off the light. She did not sleep well. What she did not know, lying in the dark thinking about numbers, was that by that point the story had already traveled to 4 other states. She did not know that in the past 8 hours, it had been told and retold through phone calls and messages that moved through a network she had no framework for understanding. She did not know the names of the men who had listened to Marcus Reed tell them what happened, or how many of them had sat in silence when they heard it before saying something quietly into their phones. She did not know about the conversations happening right then in garages and diners and on highways about a young woman in Silver Creek, Arizona, who had spent $34 of her own money and her entire job on the principle that a person's dignity didn't have a price tag. She did not know about the plans being made. She did not know that by sunrise, everything was going to look completely different. She just didn't know. She lay in the dark and she thought about the numbers and she waited for morning. The morning after Emma Carter lost her job, she woke up at 4:30 out of pure muscle memory. Her body didn't know yet. Her body still thought it had somewhere to be. She lay in the dark for 30 seconds before it caught up with her, the whole weight of it arriving, the way bad things always arrive the morning after. Not with drama, but with a kind of quiet, settled certainty. No alarm to turn off, no apron to grab, no drive to make in the cold. Just the ceiling above her and the legal pad on the kitchen table with the numbers that still didn't work. Except now there was one more problem added to the list and no paycheck coming to offset it. She got up anyway. She made coffee because the alternative was lying in bed thinking about the numbers, and Emma Carter had never been the kind of person who could lie in bed thinking. She needed her hands doing something. She needed to be upright and moving because movement was the only thing that had ever made the impossible feel like something that could eventually be negotiated with. She was on her second cup when her phone buzzed. Text message, unknown number. She almost didn't read it, and then she did. It said, Emma, this is Marcus Reed. I know it's early. Call me when you're up. She stared at the message. It was 5:14 in the morning. The man had texted her at 5:14 in the morning, which meant either he was up very early or he hadn't been to sleep yet, and neither option suggested that whatever he wanted to talk about was small. She called. He picked up on the first ring. Emma, he said, and thank you for calling back. It's 5 in the morning, and she said, I know, he said. I've been up since 3. There's been a pause, and she could hear in that pause something that sounded like the particular kind of careful that people use when they are about to say something they know is going to change the shape of a conversation. There's been a lot of talk since last night about what happened to you. Emma set down her coffee cup. What kind of talk? The good kind, Marcus said, but the kind that tends to become something larger than talk. She said, Marcus, what does that mean? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it means that William told me what happened, and I told some people, and those people told some people. And now there are men in 4 different states who know your name and know what you did and know what it cost you. Emma sat down at the kitchen table. The legal pad was still there from the night before the number staring up at her. She said, I told William it wasn't his fault. He knows that, Marcus said. That's not why people are talking. Then why are they talking? Because, Marcus said, and his voice had a quality to it that Emma couldn't entirely read something between gravity and something that was almost gentle. Because what you did is rare. And the people in my world, the people I ride with and have ridden with for a long time, we know rare when we see it. We don't get treated the way you treated William very often, Emma. Most places when Iron walks in, people either leave or they make it very clear they'd like him to. You didn't do either. You walked straight up to him and you gave him water before he even asked for it. Emma said, that's just what you do. No, Marcus said quietly. It isn't, that's the whole point. After she hung up, she sat very still for a moment. Then she refilled her coffee and went back to the legal pad and did something she almost never allowed herself to do, which was sit with uncertainty instead of solving it. She didn't know what Marcus meant by something larger than talk. She didn't know if that was good or bad or somewhere in between. She only knew that the calls from the night before had not felt like isolated gestures, and Marcus calling her at 5 in the morning did not feel like an isolated gesture either. And there was a shape forming at the edges of this situation that she couldn't quite see yet, but could feel the outline of. Jake found her there an hour later, still at the table, the legal pad untouched. You didn't sleep, he said. It wasn't a question. I slept some more, Emma said. He sat down across from her. He was 22 years old, and he had his mother's way of reading a room without asking about it, which meant he sat and waited the way their mother used to sit and wait until Emma was ready to talk. She told him about Marcus. Jake listened. He said, "What do you think he meant? Something larger than talk." "I don't know," Emma said. "Are you worried?" Emma thought about it. She said, "No, I don't know why, but no." Jake looked at her for a moment, and then he said something that stayed with her for a long time afterward. He said, "You know what Mom used to say? She used to say that kindness travels farther than cruelty, because cruelty makes people want to stop, and kindness makes people want to keep going." Emma looked at her brother. "I'm just saying," Jake said, and stood up and went to pour himself coffee. Emma picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. She spent the morning making calls. Former coworkers who might know of openings. A restaurant she'd heard was hiring 2 towns over a catering company. She'd done a shift for 3 years back. Each call was polite and professional, and she left her number and moved to the next one the way you did when you had been doing this long enough to know that the job wasn't to find the answer today. The job was to make enough calls that one of them eventually turned into an answer. She was between calls at 11:30 when her phone rang. Not Marcus this time. Different number, a woman's voice she didn't recognize, warm and slightly out of breath. "Is this Emma Carter?" "Emma, my name is Carol. I run a Facebook group for veterans families in the Silver Creek area, and I saw what someone posted this morning about what happened to you, and I wanted to reach out. We'd love to have you come speak if you're open to it. And also, I don't know if this helps, but my husband's cousin manages the diner out on Route 12, and I could give you his number if..." Emma said, "Wait, what did someone post?" Carol said, "About what happened at the Golden Road yesterday, about how you were fired for helping a biker." Emma said very carefully, "Who posted it?" "I'm not sure," Carol said. "It came through someone who knows someone. You know how these things go. But it's gotten a lot of shares, honey. A lot of people are talking about it." After she hung up from Carol, Emma went to her phone and typed her own name into the search bar of the one social media platform she rarely used. She found it in under a minute. A post that someone had written not long, 4 or 5 sentences describing what had happened at the Golden Road Diner the day before. No drama, no exaggeration. Just the facts. Waitress gave water and a meal to a Hells Angels member. Manager told her to throw him out. She refused, got fired. The post had been shared nearly 800 times. Emma stared at the number. Then she called Marcus back. He answered immediately. "You saw it," he said. "Who wrote it?" Emma said. "Someone who heard the story and wanted people to know," Marcus said. "I don't want to say more than that right now." "Marcus," Emma said, "I need to know what's happening." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Emma, when someone in our world does something for one of us, really does something at cost to themselves without asking for anything, we notice. We've been around long enough to know that doesn't happen every day. And when it does happen, we don't ignore it." Emma said, "What are you doing?" "Nothing that should worry you," he said. "I promise you that. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay," she said. "Are you doing all right financially? With the job gone?" The question landed in the pit of her stomach with the specific weight of questions that are asked by people who already know the answer and want to give you the dignity of saying it yourself. Emma said, "I'll manage." "Emma, my brother has medical bills," she said. "I'm the primary income, so no, it's not fine, but I'll figure it out. I always do." Marcus said, "Okay." His voice was very steady. "Thank you for telling me." She said, "What are you going to do with that?" He said, "Make sure the right people know the whole picture." She didn't know what that meant. She also surprisingly found that she trusted it. There was something about Marcus Reed's voice, the way it carried weight without throwing it around, that made her feel against all practical logic, like something was being handled with care. The calls kept coming through the afternoon. Not all of them were from strangers. Her former coworker at the Golden Road, a woman named Sandra, who had worked the lunch shift for 7 years, called at 2 o'clock. "Emma," she said, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who is trying to be composed about something that is making being composed very difficult. "I just want you to know that 3 of us in the back talked about walking out this morning, after you left." "Sandra, please don't." "We didn't," Sandra said. "I know we didn't, and I'm not proud of that, but I want you to know we thought about it." Emma said, "I wouldn't have wanted you to lose your jobs over this." Sandra said, "I know you wouldn't. That's why I feel bad." A pause. "David's been in a mood all day. The owner called this morning, apparently." Michael Bennett, he almost never comes in. He called David, and they were in the office for 40 minutes. Emma said, "What do you know about what they talked about?" "Nothing," Sandra said. But David came out looking like he'd been taken apart and put back together wrong. That's all I'll say. After Sandra, a man named Pete, who identified himself only as someone who knew Marcus, called to say he'd heard the story, and that if Emma needed a reference for any restaurant work in the greater Arizona area, she should feel free to use his name, and he gave her the names of 4 establishments across 2 counties where he had relationships with the owners. Emma wrote them all down. Then she looked at the list and felt, for the first time since the morning before, something that was not quite hope but was in the vicinity of it, a sense that the ground, which had been giving way under her for the past 24 hours, might be in the process of steadying. She was writing thank you texts to 3 different people when her phone rang again, and this time she recognized the number. It was Marcus. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it before you hear it from anywhere else." Emma put her pen down. "Iron William, he's been making calls all day," Marcus said. "Not just to me, to people across the chapters. There are men in Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, and Albuquerque who know your name right now." Emma said, "Marcus, let me finish," he said gently but firmly. "The reason I'm telling you is because I think some of them are going to want to do something. Not anything that should worry you, but something visible, something that says," he paused, choosing words carefully, "something that says that what happened to you mattered to us, and I need to know if you're all right with that." Emma stood up from the kitchen table. She walked to the window and she stood there looking out at the street without seeing it, the phone pressed to her ear, and she said, "What does something visible mean?" "It means some of us might want to show up," Marcus said. "In Silver Creek." Emma said, "Show up how, Bauman?" "Show up the way we show up," Marcus said, "together." The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. Emma was calculating things that had nothing to do with numbers. She was calculating the feeling in her chest, which was complicated. Part of her was resistant, the part that had spent her whole adult life insisting on managing things herself and not needing anyone to fight her battles for her. And part of her was something else entirely, something she didn't have a good name for, something that felt like being seen so clearly by people she had never met that it made her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. She said, "I don't want trouble." "There won't be trouble," Marcus said. "You have my word." "I don't want it to be about—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't want it to be about making someone look bad or getting revenge or—" "Emma," Marcus said, and his voice was so calm and so certain that it cut through all of the noise in her head. "It's not going to be any of those things. It's going to be about you. It's going to be about what you did and what it meant. That's all." Emma was quiet. Then she said, "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said, "if you're willing." She stood at the window for a long moment. Outside, Silver Creek went about its business the way small Arizona towns go about their business, slowly, practically, without a great deal of noise. She thought about the legal pad on the kitchen table. She thought about Jake's surgery fund. She thought about William Walker's face when she had set the water glass in front of him, the way he'd held it with both hands like something he needed very badly to hold. She said, "Okay." Marcus said, "Okay," and she could hear underneath the word something that was unmistakably warmth. "Emma, one more thing." "What?" "William wanted me to ask you. He wanted to know if you'd be there in the morning. He said he'd like you to see it." Emma said, "See what?" Marcus said. "What happens when someone is reminded that they matter?" She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "Tell him yes." After she hung up, she sat back down at the kitchen table. Jake was in the living room watching something, and she could hear the television, and she thought about going in there and telling him about the conversation, and instead she sat at the table and she did something she almost never did, which was nothing. She just sat. She let the afternoon quiet settle around her. She let herself feel without analyzing or planning or calculating the strange and overwhelming reality that the simplest thing she had ever done, walking across a diner and handing a man a glass of water, had traveled across 4 states in 24 hours and was coming back to her in a shape she couldn't have imagined. She thought about what Jake had said that morning. Kindness makes people want to keep going. She thought about her mother, who had believed this in her bones and had tried to pass it on, and how Emma had always thought she understood it intellectually without ever quite believing it could be true at the scale her mother seemed to mean it. She was starting to think her mother had known something Emma was still catching up to. She went to bed earlier than usual. She set no alarm because she had nowhere to be in the morning, except now she did. She lay in the dark and she thought about what Marcus had said. What happens when someone is reminded that they matter? She turned those words over and looked at them from different angles, and every angle she came at them from made something in her chest do the same complicated thing. She slept. And while she slept, across Arizona and New Mexico and into Nevada, the phone calls were still happening. The message was still traveling. In diners not unlike the Golden Road over coffee at hours, when most people were asleep, men who had spent their lives being the reason rooms went quiet were talking about a 25-year-old waitress who had done something so unremarkable in theory and so extraordinary in practice that none of them could stop thinking about it. They were talking about what it meant to be treated like a person by someone who had nothing to gain from doing it. They were talking about a glass of water that cost a woman her job. They were talking about what you do when someone does something like that. And one by one, they were making the same decision. In Phoenix, a man named Ray, who had ridden for 30 years, filled his gas tank and looked at a map of Arizona and calculated the distance to Silver Creek. In Tucson, a man named Dez, who went by a nickname that had something to do with a bridge he jumped off in 1987, called 3 other men and said, "You hear about the woman in Silver Creek?" And within 10 minutes, all 3 of them had said yes, and all 3 of them had said they were going. In Flagstaff, a man named Charlie, who had known William Walker since both of them were young enough that neither of them liked to do the math on how long ago that was, sat in his garage and thought about a Tuesday morning in a diner he'd never been to, and a woman he'd never met, and a glass of water, and what it meant that someone out there still acted that way. He called his wife into the garage. He said, "I'm going to Silver Creek tomorrow morning." His wife, who had been married to him for 27 years and understood most things about him without needing them explained, said, "The waitress." "The waitress," he said. She said, "You coming back the same day?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "Be careful." The way she always said it, which was not fearful but automatic, the muscle memory of a long marriage. Then she said, "Tell her, Toru," and stopped. Charlie said, "Tell her what?" His wife thought for a moment. Then she said, "Tell her it was a good thing she did. Tell her we see it." He said, "I will." He went to bed. He set his alarm for 4:30. In a roadside motel room outside of Kingman, William Walker lay on a bed that was somewhat better than the alternative and thought about a young woman walking out of a diner with her jacket in her hands and her head held steady and something in her face that was not defeat. He had seen defeat on people's faces. He knew exactly what it looked like. What he had seen on Emma Carter's face was different. It was the expression of someone who had made a choice they could live with, which was something William had not always been certain he could say about his own choices, and the clarity of it had stayed with him through the drive and the motel check-in and the hours of lying in this room turning it over. She had said, "It'll be mine," meaning the mistake, meaning she claimed it fully consequence, and all before she even knew if she'd been wrong. That kind of certainty, that willingness to own something completely, was something William Walker had enormous respect for because it was harder than most people knew and rarer than most people admitted. He closed his eyes. He thought, "I hope she understands what's coming." He thought, "I hope it doesn't overwhelm her." He thought, "I hope she knows it's not pity. It was never pity. It was recognition." He turned off the light. Tomorrow was going to be something. He didn't know yet exactly how many people were going to ride into Silver Creek in the morning. The number was still growing. He'd been getting texts for hours. He'd stopped counting at 140, not because people had stopped committing, but because counting had started to feel beside the point. The point wasn't the number. The point was the reason. The point was that Emma Carter had done something real and costly and completely uncalculated, and the people who understood the value of that were going to show up and say so, and nobody was going to be able to take that away from her. He thought about her face when she'd shaken his hand at the counter. He thought about what she'd said, "I'd do it again." He believed her. He also thought with something that was close to a smile in the dark, David Collins has absolutely no idea what tomorrow morning looks like. And on that thought, William Walker, 62 years old, road-worn and pain-tired, and more moved by one Tuesday morning in a small-town diner than he'd been moved by most things in recent memory, fell asleep. Outside, the desert was cold and quiet, and the roads that led towards Silver Creek were empty. They would not be empty in the morning. Across Arizona and the surrounding states, engines were checked and tanks were filled and alarm clocks were set, and men who had been many different things in their lives were about to be, for one morning, a single simple thing, the visible proof that kindness had a reach that the people who tried to punish it never anticipated. Emma Carter was asleep in her house in Silver Creek, Arizona, with her legal pad on the kitchen table and her brother's medication on the counter, and 11 days until the mortgage was due. She did not know that she was about to wake up to something she would spend the rest of her life trying to adequately describe to people who asked her what it felt like. She was just asleep, and the roads were getting ready. Emma's alarm didn't wake her. Marcus's call did. It came at 6:47 in the morning, and she grabbed the phone off the nightstand the way you grab a phone when you've been half expecting it, when some part of your sleeping brain has been listening for it all night without telling the rest of you. She answered before she was fully awake and said, "Marcus?" "Emma." His voice was different from the night before, not tighter exactly, fuller, like something had been building toward it and had finally arrived. "Are you up?" "I am now," she said, and sat up and pushed her hair back. "What time is it?" "Almost 7, he said. "I need you to get dressed and get in your car. Not fast, take your time, eat something if you can. But I need you to come to the diner this morning." Emma said, "The Golden Road." "Yes." She was quiet for a second. "Marcus, I don't work there anymore." "I know," he said. "That's not why I'm asking you to come." She said, "Then why?" His answer was 3 words, and they were simple, and they landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she didn't fully understand yet. He said, "Because they're here." Emma stopped moving. She said, "How many?" Marcus said, "More than I expected." "Marcus?" Her voice was very steady and very quiet. "How many?" A pause. She could hear in the background of the call something that was not traffic and was not wind, but was something between the two. Something rhythmic and low and vast, like the sound of a thing that moves as one body. She couldn't identify it immediately. Then she could. She'd heard single motorcycles her whole life. She had never heard that many at once. "I stopped counting," Marcus said, "around 280. Emma Carter sat on the edge of her bed and did not say anything for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "I'm getting dressed." Jake was already in the kitchen when she came out because Jake always knew when something was happening before Emma told him, and he'd apparently heard enough of the call through the thin walls of their house to understand that this morning was not a regular morning. He was standing at the counter in his sweater and the compression sleeve he wore on his left leg, and he had coffee made, and he said, "I'm coming with you." Emma said, "Jake." "I'm coming with you," he said, again with a simplicity that closed the subject. He handed her a cup of coffee. "Drink this first." She drank it, standing at the counter, too wired to sit. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her because the rest of her felt like she was standing at the edge of something vast, without being able to see the bottom. She felt Jake watching her with the same quiet attention he always gave situations he was trying to understand, and she said without looking at him, "I don't know what I'm driving into." "I know," Jake said. "Marcus says there are almost 300 people." "I know," Jake said again. He picked up his own coffee. "You okay?" Emma thought about it. She said, "I think so. I can't tell if I'm nervous or—" "You're not nervous," Jake said. "You're not used to being on the receiving end." She looked at him. He shrugged with one shoulder, the gesture so like their father's that it stopped her breath for a half second. "You give things," he said. "That's who you are. Someone giving something back to you in a big way. That's the unfamiliar part. Not the big part, just the direction." Emma set down her coffee cup. She said, "When did you get this smart?" "I've always been this smart," Jake said. "You've been too busy taking care of everything to notice." She put on her jacket. He put on his. They drove together through the quiet of Silver Creek's early morning, and they were 3 blocks from the Golden Road Diner when Emma understood what Marcus had been trying to describe over the phone because she heard them before she could see them. That same sound she'd heard in the background of the call, except now it wasn't background. Now it was everywhere. A deep rolling vibration that moved through the car door and up through the seat and into her chest where it sat like a second heartbeat. She pulled the car to the curb. She said, "Jake?" He said, "Yeah." "You hearing that?" He said, "The whole neighborhood's hearing that." They got out of the car. Emma walked to the corner and turned it and stopped walking. The street in front of the Golden Road Diner was transformed into something she had no previous category for. Motorcycles lined both sides of the road and extended past what she could see the line of them stretching back through the intersection and around the corner in both directions. Men and women in leather vests stood in groups of 3 and 4 on the sidewalk along the curb in the parking lot. Some talking, some not talking. Most of them simply present in the way that people are present when they have come somewhere with a specific and serious intention. The number of them it was not something Emma's brain could process as a number. It was more like a fact of the landscape, like something that had been placed there solid and permanent. She stood on the corner and she could not move. Behind her, Jake made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She reached back without looking and found his arm, and she held onto it because she needed something solid, and his arm was solid, and he didn't pull away. A man separated from the group nearest to her and walked toward her. Marcus Reed was about 55 with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had lived outdoors in it for most of its life and carried the evidence of that honestly. He walked with a straight-backed ease that said he was comfortable being the person who walked toward things. He stopped in front of Emma and he looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and then he said, "You doing all right?" Emma said, "I honestly don't know." He nodded like that was the correct answer. "That's normal," he said. "Come on." He nodded toward the diner. "There's someone who wants to see you first." She followed Marcus through the crowd, and she was aware as she moved through it of the moment when people nearest to her registered who she was. It moved through the group the way a current moves through water. Not loudly, not with announcement, just a quiet shift in attention, heads turning, the low murmur of recognition. Someone said her name. Someone else said it. A man she had never seen before looked at her and nodded once. The kind of nod that means something specific and doesn't require words, and she nodded back and kept moving. William Walker was standing apart from the main group near the side of the building, and when Emma came around the corner and saw him, something in her chest released tension she hadn't known she was holding. He looked better than he had 2 days ago. Some of the pain had receded from his face, or maybe he was managing it differently, in this context, standing taller, moving with less of that careful compensation. He watched her come toward him, and he did not smile exactly. But the lines of his face arranged themselves into something that served the same purpose. "Emma," he said. "William," she said. They stood facing each other for a moment, and Emma was struck again by the directness of him, the way he looked at her without the social deflections most people used, and she met it directly because that was her nature too. She said, "Did you do this?" "I made some calls," he said. "William," she gestured at the street at the hundreds of people filling it. "This is not some calls." "I called Marcus," William said. "Marcus is better at calls than I am." Emma looked at him. She said, "Why?" He looked back at her steadily. "Why what?" "Why did you do this? I told you it wasn't your fault. I told you I made the choice." "I know what you told me," William said. "I'm not doing this because I feel guilty about what happened to you. I'm doing this because of who you are." He paused. Then he said, "You know how many places I've walked into in my life where somebody moved away from me when I came through the door?" Emma was quiet. "A lot," William said. "I'm used to it. I stopped expecting different a long time ago." "But you—" He stopped for a second, and something moved across his face that was private and real, and that he was letting her see deliberately, which she understood was not something he did casually. "You walked straight at me, in front of everyone, when your manager was watching, when it was going to cost you. You walked straight at me, and you gave me water, and you sat me down, and you asked me what I wanted to eat, like I was just a person who had walked into a diner." He shook his head slightly. "You know what that does to a man who's been walking into rooms for 40 years expecting them to go quiet when he comes in?" Emma said, "Don't say you just did what anyone would do." William said, "Because we both know that's not true. You know that's not true. David Collins was standing 15 feet away, and he did not do what you did." Emma didn't say anything. William said, "I'm 62 years old. I've been riding since I was 19. I've had good years and bad years and years I don't talk about. And I have met in all that time maybe a handful of people who had what you have." He paused. "And when I find something that rare, I believe in acknowledging it. So that's what this is. It's an acknowledgement." Emma looked out at the street. She looked at the hundreds of people who had ridden in from multiple states to stand in front of a diner in Silver Creek, Arizona on a Wednesday morning because one of their own had told them about a waitress who had done something real. She thought about her mother. She thought about Jake saying kindness makes people want to keep going. She thought about the legal pad on the kitchen table with the numbers that still didn't add up. She thought about $34 she'd put on her own tab for a man she'd never met. She said, "I'm going to cry, and I really don't want it to cry in front of 300 people." William Walker said very seriously, "Nobody here is going to say a word about it." She laughed. It came out unexpectedly real and sudden, and William's face broke into a full, unguarded smile that transformed it completely, and for a moment they were just two people standing next to a diner laughing, which was not what either of them had expected their Wednesday morning to look like. Marcus appeared beside them. "Emma," he said, "there's something you need to know before we go in." The laughter hadn't fully faded from Emma's face when she looked at him and registered his tone and understood that what he was about to say was serious. She straightened. "What?" "Michael Bennett is here," Marcus said. "The owner." Emma went still. "He came down." "He came down," Marcus said. "He's inside. He's been inside since 6:30 this morning. He got here before most of us." Oh, pause. He saw the Facebook post last night. He saw the shares. He called David Collins at 10 o'clock last night, apparently, and had a conversation that, by all accounts, was, Marcus chose his word carefully, significant. Emma said, "What does he want?" "He wants to talk to you," Marcus said, "before anything else happens. He asked if I could bring you inside." Emma looked at William. William looked back at her with an expression that said this was her call and he was not going to influence it either direction, which she appreciated. She looked back at Marcus. She said, "Is David in there?" "Yes," Marcus said. "He's in there." Emma took a breath. She straightened her jacket. She said, "Okay." She followed Marcus to the front door of the Golden Road Diner. When Marcus pulled it open, Emma stepped inside. The diner was fuller than she'd expected, and the first thing she registered was that it was full of people she recognized, not bikers, not the crowd from outside, but the diner's own employees. Sandra was there, and Terry from the kitchen, and the two young women who worked the weekend shifts, and old Gerald Hutchins was sitting at his regular stool at the counter with his coffee and his 2 sugars and his definite preference for decaf that he would never admit to. And he looked up when Emma walked in and said, "There she is," the way he said it, when she came in for her regular shift, like there had been no interruption, like Tuesday had not happened. Emma had to stop walking for a second. She collected herself. She moved toward the back. Michael Bennett was 60 years old and had owned the Golden Road Diner for 18 of them. Emma had met him maybe a dozen times over her 3 years. Each time briefly, he was not a hands-on owner in the daily sense. He was a trim, quiet man with reading glasses and an unhurried way of speaking, and he was sitting in the corner booth with his hands around a coffee cup, and when Emma came toward him, he stood up. He said, "Emma, thank you for coming in." Emma said, "Of course." They sat down across from each other. Emma noticed peripherally David Collins sitting 2 booths away alone with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked like a man in the process of reconsidering a very large number of things simultaneously. He looked like the conversation with Michael at 10 o'clock last night had been as significant as Marcus said. He looked up when Emma sat down, and their eyes met briefly, and something passed across his face. Not hostility, not defiance, not the controlled flatness of the day before. Something Emma didn't have a name for yet, something that might, given enough time and honesty, become something worth naming. She looked away from him and back to Michael. Michael said, "I want to start by saying that I'm sorry." Emma held his gaze and waited. "I saw the post last night," he said. "I read through the comments. I called Sandra. She confirmed what happened. I called David." He paused. "The decision to terminate your employment was wrong. The reasoning behind it was wrong. And I want you to know that I take full responsibility for the culture in this building that made it possible for that decision to happen, because that's on me as the owner. I set the tone, or I failed to set it. And somewhere in the last few years, I failed to set it in a way that this could happen to someone like you." Emma said, "Someone like me." Michael said, "Someone who's been here for 3 years and done her job with the kind of integrity that I should have been protecting." Emma said carefully, "What are you asking me, Michael?" He said, "I want you to come back." Emma was quiet. He said, "Not as a waitress if you don't want that. I want to offer you the assistant manager position. I think you understand this place and what it should be better than anyone in this building, and I think—" "I need to ask you something first," Emma said. He stopped. She said, "If I come back, if I'm standing behind that counter next Tuesday and someone walks in who makes the people in the corner booth uncomfortable Because of what they look like or what they're wearing or who they are, what happens? Michael said, you seat them. And if the manager on duty tells me to ask them to leave? Michael looked at her steadily. Then that manager will be having a conversation with me. Emma said, I need that to be real, not a policy on a paper, real. Michael said, I understand. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She was doing what she always did when she needed to assess whether someone was telling her the truth, not looking for nerves or evasion, but looking for the specific quality of seriousness that meant a person had thought about what they were saying before they said it and intended to mean it after. Michael Bennett had the quality. She didn't doubt that he'd had a bad night and a harder morning, and that the hundreds of people outside had clarified some things about his priorities. She said, I'll think about it. He nodded. He didn't push. She started to stand, and then she stopped because David Collins had gotten up from his booth and was walking toward them, and she went still, and she waited because she didn't know what this was, and she needed to see it before she decided what to do with it. David stopped beside the table. He looked at Michael, and then he looked at Emma. His face, without the controlled flatness of Tuesday morning, was older, somehow more complicated, like a surface that had been sanded down to reveal the grain underneath. He said, Emma. His voice had none of its Tuesday precision. It was just a voice. I owe you an apology. Emma didn't say anything. She let him have the silence. David said, what I did, the decision I made, the way I made it, I've been sitting here since 6:30 this morning trying to figure out how to say this, and the truth is, there isn't a good way to say it. I was wrong. Not just wrong in procedure or policy, wrong in the thing underneath that. Wrong in the way I looked at that man when he came in and decided before he sat down what he was. He paused. He said, you told me a person doesn't become less human because they look different from you. I've been thinking about that since you walked out the door Tuesday. Emma looked at him. She said, and he said, and I think you were right. And I think I've been making that same mistake for a long time and calling it good management. Emma studied him for a moment. Then she said, thank you for saying that. She meant it simply, without strategy, without warmth she didn't feel, and without coldness she didn't need. She meant it as what it was, an acknowledgement that he had said something real and that she had heard it. She stood up and walked to the front door. Outside, the crowd had shifted in the time she'd been inside, the way large groups shift when something is about to change. People were moving toward the diner, not entering yet, but positioning themselves the way that people do when they're gathering for something with intention. The motorcycles were still parked in both directions, the sound of them now quiet, and the visual of them in the morning light was staggering. Not in a threatening way, in an overwhelming way. In the way that any large demonstration of commitment is overwhelming when you are the person it is being demonstrated toward. Marcus was at the door. He said, ready? Emma said, for what exactly? He said, to let them in. She said, let them in. He said, Emma, these people drove through the night from 4 states to have breakfast at a diner that fired you for doing the right thing. The least we can do is make sure the diner is open when they get here. Emma looked at him. She said, Marcus, I don't work here. He said, Michael Bennett is standing right behind me, and I believe he has something to say about that. She turned. Michael was right there. He said, consider today your first day back. Whatever title you want, whenever you want to start officially. But today, if you're willing, Emma looked at the street full of people. She looked at Sandra through the window, standing behind the counter, watching her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be desperate. She looked at Terry the cook, visible through the pass-through, who raised one hand in a small wave. She looked at William Walker, who was standing to the side of the door, and who looked back at her with those pale blue eyes and said nothing, because he had already said everything he needed to say, and he understood that this moment was hers. Emma Carter took a breath. She said, somebody get me an apron. Sandra had one in her hands before Emma finished the sentence. What happened next was something that everyone who was there would try to describe for years afterward, and would always feel they'd come up short because the thing about a moment that is larger than language is that language can gesture at it, but can never fully arrive. What happened was this: Emma tied the apron around her waist, and she walked to the front door, and she pushed it open, and she stepped outside, and she said to the crowd of nearly 300 people who had ridden from across 4 states to stand in front of this particular diner on this particular Wednesday morning, come on in, coffee's on. The sound that came back to her was not applause. It was something lower and steadier than applause. It was the sound of people responding to something real, with something real which didn't need performance or ceremony. It was laughter and the clap of hands and the movement of a large group of people toward a door with a warmth that Emma felt physically like walking into somewhere heated from somewhere cold. They came in, and they kept coming in. They filled the diner past capacity, past any configuration of tables and stools and standing room that the Golden Road Diner had ever contained. And they overflowed back outside, and the ones outside sent their orders in through the ones inside. And Emma and Sandra and the other two women and Terry in the kitchen ran what became the most chaotic and most functional and most alive breakfast service the Golden Road Diner had ever produced. Terry was calling out orders in a voice that was half drowning in the noise and fully committed to the job, and Sandra was laughing in a way Emma hadn't heard from her in months. And Gerald Hutchins was at his stool telling the man sitting next to him, a large bearded rider who had driven from Albuquerque, about the time a coyote had walked into the diner back in 2009, and the rider was listening with the complete attention of someone who found this story genuinely interesting, which was the correct response because the coyote story was actually quite good. Emma moved through the crowd with the specific calm of someone who has been doing this long enough to have the chaos become rhythm. She took orders and called them back to Terry and refilled coffee and remembered names when people told her their names and brought extra napkins and found chairs when there weren't enough and smiled the smile that was not performance but was simply what her face did when she was in her element, which was this moving through a room, making people feel seen, doing the 10,000 small things that added up to the larger thing that her mother had always called making people feel at home. At one point, she passed William Walker, who had found a stool at the far end of the counter, the same end she'd seated him at on Tuesday, and he had a cup of coffee and a slice of pecan pie because Terry had made pecan on Wednesday as well, and he watched her pass and said, "Good pie," Emma said without stopping. "I know." He laughed. She kept moving. 2 hours into the service with the crowd beginning to slowly ebb as people finished and made room for others, Marcus found her near the service window and said quietly, "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "What?" "In the past 2 hours," he said, "I've watched 3 different people in this room, not our people regulars, people from the town, come up to me separately and say some version of the same thing, which is that they didn't know, that they had assumptions about who we were and they didn't know." Emma said, "Know what?" "Know that we were people," Marcus said simply. "The same way you knew William was a person on Tuesday morning. They're realizing it this morning." Emma looked out at the room, at the mix of people, bikers and townspeople and regulars and strangers all in the same space, all eating the same food, all subject to the same gravitational pull of coffee and pie and Terry's cooking and Sandra's laugh. She saw Gerald Hutchins showing the Albuquerque rider a photo on his phone, apparently of the coyote incident, since the photo apparently existed. She saw a young couple from town who came in every Wednesday sharing a booth with 2 women riders from Phoenix who were showing them something on a map. She saw David Collins, who had come back out of the office and was standing near the door, not managing, just standing, watching the room, with the expression of someone watching something they had almost prevented happen and finding to their own surprise that it was good. Emma looked at Marcus. She said, "Is this what you meant when you said something larger than talk?" Marcus said, "This is part of it." She said, "What's the rest of it?" He looked at her steadily. "The rest of it," he said, "is what happens in this town after today, in this diner, with you in it." He paused. "One morning doesn't change everything, Emma, but one morning can change what people know is possible, and that matters more than most people give it credit for." Emma thought about that. She thought about William on Tuesday moving carefully, standing at the hostess stand with that look that she knew now she would always recognize, the look of a person calculating their welcome. She thought about how it had cost her nothing that Tuesday to walk straight at him. She thought about how it had cost her everything and nothing at all at the same time. She thought about her mother and the things she used to say, and Jake saying it back to her across the kitchen table on Wednesday morning, like he'd been saving it for exactly this. She said, "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "William told me this morning he said I had something rare, what he saw in me." She looked at the room, at the improbable, overcrowded, completely alive scene in front of her. "What did he mean? What did you all see?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Someone who doesn't calculate before they're kind." Emma looked at him. He said, Most people, when they see someone like William walk into a room, they run a calculation. What do I know about this type of person? What do other people in this room expect from me? What is the cost benefit of treating this person like a human being right now in front of witnesses? Most people run that calculation in under a second, and most people come to the same conclusion. He paused. You didn't run it. You just walked toward him. That's what he saw. That's what all of us see. Emma said, it wasn't a choice. It was just what you do. I know, Marcus said. That's what makes it rare. She stood there for the moment with that letting it settle. Then someone called for more coffee from across the room, and Emma picked up the carafe and said, hold on, I'm coming, and moved back into the work because this was what she did. This was who she was, and the room was full, and the coffee needed pouring, and every person in it had come a long way for something that started with a glass of water on a Tuesday morning. And outside, the last of the motorcycles were still parked along the street, and the people of Silver Creek who had come out of their houses and their shops and their cars to look at them were realizing slowly and then all at once that whatever they'd been afraid of, when they heard the sound of all those engines, it wasn't this. It wasn't this at all. What it was 300 people who had driven through the night because someone had been decent to one of their own, which was a reason that when you said it, plainly sounded less like a biker thing and more like a human thing, more like the thing that everyone in that town in that moment understood somewhere below the level of language, the way you understand things that are true before you have the words to say why. David Collins stood at the door of the Golden Road Diner and watched it all and said nothing. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago and he hadn't noticed. He was watching Emma move through the room and he was thinking about a sentence she had said in his office 2 days ago that he had dismissed as naive and now could not get out of his head. A person doesn't become less human because they look different from you. He was thinking about all the rooms he had managed, all the people he had seen come through the door, all the times he had run the calculation. He stood there and he thought about it for a long time and nobody interrupted him, and the room stayed full and warm and loud around him, and outside the sun was fully up now, over Silver Creek, Arizona, falling on 300 motorcycles parked in a line in a town that was in the process of learning something it would not easily forget. The breakfast service ended the way big things end, not all at once, but gradually the energy unwinding in layers the crowd, thinning group by group until the diner was down to its last dozen riders and the townspeople who had stayed, not because they needed more coffee, but because they weren't ready for it to be over yet. Emma had been on her feet for 4 hours straight. She didn't feel it. That was the thing about being in your element. The fatigue existed somewhere underneath the doing of it, and it only arrived when you stopped, and Emma hadn't stopped yet, so the tiredness was theoretical. A debt she was accumulating that she'd pay later alone, when the room was quiet and the adrenaline finished its work and left her sitting at some table, staring at nothing. Sandra found her near the back booth, collecting the last of the plates. Em, she said. Her voice had the specific softness of someone who has been holding something back for several hours and has decided it's time to put it down. You need to sit for a minute. Emma said, I'm fine. Emma, Sandra took the stack of plates out of her hands, just took them without asking. Sit down. Emma sat down. The booth was the corner one, the same booth where Michael Bennett had sat that morning, and from it, Emma could see the whole room, the counter where Gerald Hutchins had finally gone home an hour ago after shaking the hand of every rider he could reach the pass-through, where Terry had worked without a break for 4 hours and had done it with the focused ferocity of a man who understood that this particular service mattered and who was not going to be the weak link in it. The front door where David Collins had stood for most of the morning, watching the room with that expression Emma still hadn't fully decoded. David was gone now. She didn't know when he'd left. She'd been too busy to track it. Sandra slid into the booth across from her and put 2 cups of coffee on the table and said, I want to tell you something. Emma wrapped her hands around the cup. Okay, yesterday morning, Sandra said, when you left after David called you into the office and you came back out and you walked through the room and I saw your face. She stopped. She looked at the table. She looked back up. I wanted to say something. I wanted to stand up and say something right then. Emma said, Sandra. Let me finish, Sandra said. I didn't. I stood there and I watched you walk out and I didn't say a word, and I've been carrying that since yesterday, and I need you to hear me say it's not something I'm proud of. Emma looked at her. Sandra was 53 years old and had been waitressing since she was 19, and had 3 kids and a mortgage that was tighter than she ever admitted to anyone. And she had stood in the diner and watched Emma get fired and had not spoken up. And the fact that it had been eating her alive since yesterday was visible in every line of her face right now. Emma said, "Sandra, you have 3 kids. I know I do. And a mortgage. I know. And David had the power to do to you exactly what he did to me." Sandra said, "That's not an excuse." "No," Emma said. "But it's a reason, and it's a real one." She reached across the table and put her hand on Sandra's. "I don't need you to have done something different. I need you to be here now, and you are." Sandra looked at her for a moment. Then she said with the directness of someone who has decided to say the rest of it while she has the courage, "You know what David said that morning after you left? He came out of the back and he stood at the counter and he said," she paused, making sure she had the words right. He said, "Some people don't know when they've made a mistake." About you, standing there with his arms crossed like he'd handled something correctly. Emma was quiet. "And Terry," Sandra said. Terry looked up through the pass-through and he said real quiet just to himself, "But we all heard it," he said. "Yeah, some people don't." She picked up her coffee. "I thought you should know." Emma thought about Terry in the kitchen this morning, working 4 straight hours without complaint, running a service that was 3 times the normal volume, with a focus that was almost aggressive in its commitment. She thought about the way he'd raised his hand through the pass-through when she'd come back in this morning, that small wave that meant something much larger than its size. She said, "I'm going to go thank him." She found Terry in the kitchen, wiping down the grill with the methodical thoroughness of a man who liked things done properly and didn't cut corners on the last step just because the hard part was over. He looked up when Emma came in and said, "You shouldn't be back here." And the tone was the tone he used for anyone who came into his kitchen without a direct operational reason. Emma said, "I know, I'll be fast." She stopped a few feet from him because Terry was a man who needed his space respected, even when you were thanking him, and she said, "Thank you for this morning. That was what you did out there today. I want you to know it mattered." Terry looked at her. He had been at the Golden Road Diner for 11 years, which was 9 years longer than Emma, and in those 11 years he had developed opinions about most things that were firm and not frequently revised. He said, "You know what I thought when you walked back in this morning?" Emma said, "What?" He said, "I thought, good. Right order of things finally." He went back to wiping the grill. "That's all I have to say about it." Emma smiled. She said, "Okay, Terry. You can go back out now," he said. She went back out. Michael Bennett was waiting near the front jacket on coffee, finished the posture of a man who is about to leave but has one more thing to say first. He saw Emma and waited for her to come to him, which she did, and when she reached him, he said, "I have to ask you something directly." Emma said, "Go ahead." "This morning," he said, "what happened in this room, what I saw you do, the way this place ran, the way people felt in here, is that what you have in mind when you think about what this diner should be?" Emma looked at the room. The last few riders were finishing up talking to each other, talking to the remaining townspeople in no hurry. The atmosphere was nothing like the controlled, efficient, corporate-adjacent diner David Collins had managed. It was louder and messier and more alive, and every person in it looked like they were exactly where they wanted to be. She said, "Yes, that's what I have in mind." Michael nodded slowly. He said, "Then I want to be honest with you about something. What happened yesterday, David's decision, it didn't happen in a vacuum. I built a management culture here that prioritized the wrong things. Numbers, appearances, the opinion of customers I was afraid to lose. And I let that culture run this place without checking it, and this is the result." He said it plainly without the hedging that people usually employed when they were admitting institutional failure. "I'm telling you this because if you come back here, not just to work, but to actually change something, you need to know that I understand what went wrong at the structural level, not just the personal one." Emma said, "And David?" Michael said, "I've had a long conversation with David." Emma said, "About, oh yeah," and Michael said, "About whether he can work in the kind of place you just described, the kind of place you ran this morning." A pause. "He told me he'd like to try." Emma looked at Michael carefully. She said, "That's not a small thing." "No," Michael agreed, "it isn't." "It's easy to say it in the middle of a morning like this one," Emma said, "when the room is full and the feeling is right and it's obvious that what happened yesterday was wrong. The harder version is a random Tuesday at 7 in the morning when it's slow and there's no audience and someone uncomfortable walks through the door. She met Michael's eyes. That's the version I need to know about. Michael said, I know. And I told David the same thing. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll come back on one condition. Michael said, name it. She said, I want the authority to make real decisions, not just about operations, about how we treat people. If I see something wrong, I need to be able to say so and have it mean something. I'm not interested in a title that exists on paper and stops at the edge of David's comfort zone. Michael said, you have it. She said, in writing. He said, in writing. She said, okay then. They shook hands. Emma walked back to the counter and picked up the coffee carafe because there were still people in the room and the carafe was half full, and that was the job. It was while she was refilling the last cups that Marcus touched her arm and said quietly, he wants to say goodbye before he rides out. She didn't have to ask who. William Walker was near the door jacket on keys in his hand, looking like a man who had done what he came to do and was ready for the road again. Emma walked toward him and he turned when he heard her coming, and they stopped a few feet apart and looked at each other the way they'd looked at each other by the side of the diner that morning directly without performance. Emma said, you're heading out. Gotta get to Tucson, he said. Couple of days late already. She said, how's the ride going to be? He looked at her steadily. Better, he said, than when I came in. She nodded. She said, William, can I ask you something I should have asked Tuesday? He said, anything. She said, what were you doing in Flagstaff? You said you'd had a rough couple of days. Something shifted in his face, not closed off, just moved to a different depth. He said, my brother, he passed 6 days ago. I was up there settling some things. Emma went still. He said, he was sick for a while. It wasn't a surprise, but... He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, and then back up the way people do when they're deciding how much of something they're going to say. He was the last one, my last family. And after I got things sorted in Flagstaff, I got on the bike because that's what I do when I don't know what else to do. And I rode. And somewhere between Flagstaff and Silver Creek, I ran out of... He paused, searching for the right word. And when he found it, it was simple. I ran out of road in a way, and I pulled off. And I came into your diner. Emma said, William. He said, you couldn't have known. No, she said, but Emma, his voice was very gentle for a voice that usually carried such weight. What you did that morning, sitting me down and getting me water and making me eat something, you did that for a stranger. You didn't know about my brother or what I'd been through that week. You just did it because you saw a person who needed it. He said, that's the version that means something. Not the version where you knew. Emma felt the thing in her throat that she'd told him earlier she was trying to avoid. She held it steady. She said, I'm glad you came in. He said, me too. She said, I mean it. I'm glad you came into that diner on that particular morning. He said, so am I. And then with the directness that was entirely his, he said, you're going to be all right, Emma Carter. She said, yeah, I think I am. He held out his hand. She shook it. His hand was warmer than it had been on Tuesday, and steadier, and she held it for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasted, and he let her. Then he said the pecan pie was the best I've had in a long time, and walked out the door. Emma stood there for a moment after he left her hand at her side, and she breathed. Jake appeared beside her. She hadn't tracked where he'd been for the past hour. He'd been somewhere in the crowd. She'd caught glimpses of him, once talking to one of the riders from Phoenix, once sitting with Gerald Hutchins, in the old man's regular spot. He appeared beside her now and didn't say anything, just stood there, which was what she needed. After a minute, she said, his brother died. Jake said, I know, he told me. She looked at him. You talked to him. For a while, Jake said, earlier, while you were working. He looked at the door William had just walked out of. He's a good man, Emma said, yeah. Jake said, he told me something. What? Jake was quiet for a second in the way he got quiet when he was about to say something that mattered. Then he said he's been riding for 40 years and he's walked into a lot of rooms and most of them he left feeling smaller than when he came in. He said he walked into this one smaller than he'd ever felt because of losing his brother, because of what that week had been. And he walked out feeling... Jake paused, making sure he got the word right. He said he walked out feeling located. That's the word he used. Like he knew where he was again. Emma looked at her brother. He looked back at her. She said, that's well. I know, Jake said. They stood together for a moment in the quiet of the nearly empty diner. Then Emma said, I took the job back. Jake said, good. Assistant manager. Good, he said again. And the simplicity of it, the utter absence of surprise, made her realize that he had never doubted this was where she was going to land, and that he had been certain of it longer than she had. She said, I'm going to need to do things differently. Set new terms, make sure it's not just a title. I know, Jake said, and I'm going to need David Collins to be a different kind of manager than he's been. Jake said, do you think he can be? Emma thought about David standing at the door all morning watching. Not performing, not positioning himself, just watching with that stripped expression of a man in the middle of a genuine reckoning. She thought about his apology, which had been short and had lacked the polished quality of a rehearsed apology, and had therefore been more convincing than a polished one would have been. She thought about Sandra saying he had stood at the counter afterward and said, some people don't know when they've made a mistake, and Terry saying quietly in response, yeah, some people don't, and whether David had heard that and what it might have planted. She said, I think he's trying to figure out if he can be. Jake said, that might be enough to start. It might, Emma said. I guess we'll find out. The last of the riders left over the next 30 minutes, each of them stopping on the way out to say something to Emma, to shake a hand to settle their bill with a generosity that made Terry's eyes go wide when he saw the totals. A man named Ray from Phoenix, who had barely said 10 words all morning, stopped at the door and turned back and said, the next time someone tells you kindness doesn't pay. He pointed at the room, the full cash register, the townspeople still lingering, the energy that was going to take hours to dissipate. You tell them they're wrong. Then he walked out. Marcus was the last to leave, and he didn't leave without finding Emma one more time. He found her at the counter making a list. She had already started making lists, which was her nature, the planning brain kicking in the moment the crisis phase receded. The list said things like new training guidelines, complaint, protocols, vendor review, staff meeting, Thursday. The practical architecture of change built in the same handwriting that had written the mortgage payment and Jake's medical bills on a legal pad 2 mornings ago. Marcus sat down at the counter. He said, how do you feel? Emma said, like I have a lot of work to do. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, and it was good, warm, and unguarded, the laugh of a man who didn't do it constantly, but meant it when he did. He said, that's the right answer. She said, Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. He said, always. She said, today was, she stopped because the word that came immediately was extraordinary. And it was true, but it was also not quite sufficient, not quite accurate enough for what she actually needed to say. She tried again. Today was the largest thing anyone has ever done for me, and I need you to know that I understand that. I want you to know I don't take it lightly. Marcus looked at her steadily. She said, but I'm also sitting here trying to understand why. Not why in the way where I don't believe it happened. Why in the way where I want to understand the real reason, the underneath reason, so I can carry it correctly. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, can I tell you about something? Please, she said. He said, I've been writing for 32 years. I have a wife, 2 daughters, who are grown now, a house I've lived in for 20 years. I pay my taxes. I volunteer at the Veterans Center on the 3rd Saturday of every month. I coach my nephew's little league team in the spring. He looked at her calmly. And there is not a single week that goes by that I don't walk into a place and watch someone make a decision about me based on my jacket before I've said a word. Not a week. Emma said nothing. Restaurants, Marcus said, stores, government offices, places I have every right to be. And people look at me and they run the calculation you and I talked about, and most of the time, the calculation comes out the same way. He paused. Now, I don't need their approval. I'm past needing it. But I want you to understand what accumulates, Emma, over 32 years of that, what that does to a man's understanding of how the world sees him. Emma said softly, I hear you. And then Marcus said, William calls me on a Tuesday evening and tells me about a waitress in Silver Creek who didn't run the calculation, who just walked straight at him, who spent her own money, who got fired for it and walked out with her head up. He looked at her. That's not just a nice story, Emma. That's proof that it's possible, that there are still people out there who see a person when they look at a person. And when you've been running on belief for a long time without evidence, when you've been telling yourself that the world has that in it somewhere, even when the evidence keeps suggesting otherwise, and then you get evidence, He stopped. Emma said, "It matters. It matters more than I know how to say," Marcus said. "So we came, because it wasn't just about you and it wasn't just about William. It was about what you proved. And we wanted you to know that proof was seen." Emma sat with that for a long time. The diner was quiet now, nearly empty, just the two of them at the counter, and Sandra wiping tables in the back. The overhead lights hummed their perpetual low note, and the coffee in the carafe had gone the specific shade of dark that means it's been sitting too long. And Emma thought about 32 years in the calculation and what accumulates and what proof does for a person who has been running on belief. She said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said, "Thank you, Emma." He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He was almost at the door when Emma said, "Marcus." He turned. She said, "Tell William, tell him I'm glad he pulled off the highway." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "He knows." The door closed behind him. Emma sat at the counter for a moment in the quiet. Then she picked up her pen and looked at her list and thought about what came next, because that was what you did. You didn't sit in the feeling forever, because the feeling didn't pay Jake's bills, and the feeling didn't change the diner, and the feeling, as real and large as it was not the work. It was the reason for the work. And there was a difference, and Emma understood the difference, and she picked up her pen. She was writing when Jake came and sat down beside her. He read the list over her shoulder without commenting, and then he said, "What's the first thing, the most important one, brah?" Emma said, "The people who work here, make sure they know it's safe to be decent. Make sure they know the rules have changed and that I'll back them up when it costs something." Jake said, "And second." Emma said, "The community. This diner should be doing more than serving breakfast. There are people in this town who need—" She stopped because the list of what people needed was long, and she was not going to write the whole thing down right now, right here. She was going to start with the most urgent item and move from there the way you moved from the first number on the legal pad to the next and then the next. There are people in this town who need to know there's a place that's actually for them. All of them. Jake said, "You're going to make this into something." Emma said, "That's the plan." Jake said, "Mom would have liked today." Emma set down her pen. She did not cry. She had promised herself she was done, almost crying for one day, and she was honoring that. But she sat for a moment with her pen down, and she thought about her mother, who had believed in the traveling power of kindness, with a conviction that had always seemed slightly too large for practical application, who had passed that belief on the way you pass things on, not through speeches, but through behavior, through the everyday example of a life lived with a specific orientation toward other people, toward their invisible weight, toward the unremarkable, extraordinary act of noticing them. She thought about the glass of water. She thought about $34 on her own tab. She thought about 300 people on 300 motorcycles crossing state lines in the dark to come to a small desert diner and sit at the counter and order eggs. She thought maybe the conviction wasn't too large after all. Maybe her mother had known exactly what she was talking about. She picked up her pen. She went back to the list. Outside, the last of the motorcycles were gone from the street, and Silver Creek had resumed its ordinary Wednesday business. But it was resuming it with something different in the air, a residue of the morning that people would not immediately have words for, but would feel for days. The way you feel the warmth of a room after you've left it, the way a specific quality of light stays in your eyes longer than the source of it. People who had stood on the street that morning and watched 300 riders pull up to the Golden Road Diner had watched them leave politely, quietly, with the controlled courtesy of people who had come for a specific purpose and fulfilled it. They had watched, and they had thought things privately that they would eventually say out loud to their families at dinner, and the things they thought and eventually said were versions of the same thing they were wrong about those people. Or more precisely and more uncomfortably, they had assumed things about those people that turned out not to be true, and the discomfort of that was productive discomfort, the kind that moves something. David Collins drove home at noon. He sat in his car in his driveway for 15 minutes before going inside. His wife met him in the hallway and looked at his face and said, "How was it?" He said, "I need to tell you about something I did." She said, "Okay." He said, "I think I need to sit down first." She said, "Come on," and led him to the kitchen, and she made coffee, and he told her all of it from Tuesday morning to this morning, from Emma at the counter to the crowd outside the window, to Michael's call the night before, to Emma's apology, which she'd given without being asked and without making it bigger than it was, and which for that reason had hit him harder than a larger apology would have. He told his wife all of it, and she listened the way she'd been listening to him for 19 years with a complete attention that never felt like judgment, even when the thing being said deserved judgment. When he finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Try to be different." She said, "That's not very specific." He said, "I know, I'm working on the specific part." She said, "Is Emma going back?" She said, "Yes." His wife said, "Good." She said, "It's simply and directly the way you say things when you mean exactly the thing you're saying and nothing else." Then she said, "You should call her." David said, "I already apologized." His wife said, "I know. Call her anyway. Not to apologize again, just to say she thought about it, just to say you're glad she's coming back." David looked at his wife. He said, "You think she'd want to hear that from me?" His wife said, "I think it matters that you say it regardless." He called at 4:30 that afternoon. Emma was home by then at the kitchen table, not with the legal pad this time, but with a notebook she'd gone out and bought specifically for this, a new one for the new thing she was building. She saw David's name on her phone and she looked at it for one ring and then answered. He said, "Emma, it's David." She said, "I know." He said, He stopped, started again. "I wanted to say that I'm glad you're coming back, not because it's good for the diner, because it's right. And I know the difference between those two things now, and I want you to know that I know." Emma sat at her kitchen table with the new notebook open in front of her and the pen in her hand, and she looked at the window and she said, "Okay, David." He said, "That's it. That's all I wanted to say." She said, "I'll see you Thursday." He said, "Thursday." A pause. "Thank you for picking up." She said, "Thank you for calling." She hung up. She looked at the notebook. She wrote at the top of the first page in her even practical handwriting, "Staff meeting Thursday, 8 a.m. Start here." Jake came in from the living room and stood in the doorway looking at her. He said, "David." She said, "David." He said, "And." She said, "And I think he's going to try." Jake said, "That's something." "It is," Emma said. "It's a start." She looked at the notebook. "Everything is a start. That's the whole thing, really. You start, and then you start again. And then you start again after that." Jake looked at his sister for a moment, at the notebook and the pen, and the expression on her face that was the expression of someone who had been through something large and had come out the other side not damaged but clarified, like glass after fire, like something refined rather than burned. He said, "Em." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You know what today was, really?" She said, "What?" He said, "Tuesday, just Tuesday again. You doing what you do, in a room full of people who could see it." Emma looked at her brother. He was right. That was exactly what it was. She picked up her pen and went back to the notebook, and outside in Silver Creek the Wednesday afternoon was going about its business, ordinary and unremarkable, which was the only ground that anything extraordinary ever actually grew from. The Thursday staff meeting had just started at 8 in the morning and ran until 10:15. Emma had not planned for it to run that long. She had planned for 90 minutes, enough time to lay out the new framework, answer questions, address the obvious tensions, and get everyone back on the floor before the breakfast rush peaked. But at the 90-minute mark, she looked around the table at Sandra and Terry, and the two weekend women whose names were Becca and Luce, and at David Collins, sitting at the end with his hands folded and his mouth closed, and his eyes doing the careful work of a man trying to listen rather than manage. And she realized that what was happening in that room was not a staff meeting. It was something older and more necessary than a staff meeting. It was people saying the things that had been true for a long time and had not been safe to say, and you didn't cut that off at 90 minutes. So she let it run. Becca went first, which surprised everyone, and including Becca, because Becca was 23 and had been working weekends for 8 months and had given every impression of being someone who kept her head down and her opinions private. She said, "I had a family come in 3 weeks ago. Hispanic family, 4 kids, kind of loud. The kids were running around a little. And David," she stopped, looked at David, "made the decision to continue. David asked me to ask them to keep it down and suggested they might be more comfortable at the place on Route 12. The room was quiet. Becca said, "They weren't doing anything wrong. The kids were just kids. And I went over there and I said what he told me to say, and the mother looked at me." She stopped again, and Emma could see her working to keep her voice steady. The mother looked at me like she'd been expecting it, like she'd been waiting for that moment since they walked in. And I have thought about that look every single day since. David said, "Becca." She looked at him. He said, "I'm sorry." He said it simply without building anything around it. "That was wrong. I was wrong." Becca looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't mean forgiveness yet, but means the apology was received and registered and would be considered. Luz went next, then Sandra, who had apparently been holding a list of incidents in her memory for somewhere between 2 and 4 years, and delivered them with the measured precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact meeting. Terry didn't say anything until near the end, and when he did, he said only this: "I've worked here 11 years. This is the first time I've sat at this table." He looked at Emma. "That's all." Emma said, "That changes today." He nodded. He went back to his coffee. Emma laid out the new framework in the last 45 minutes. Not rules exactly. She'd thought carefully about this because rules were David's language, and she didn't want to just write new rules over old ones and call it change. What she laid out was closer to a set of commitments. Commitments the diner was making to every person who walked through the door, and commitments the team was making to each other. And the difference between a rule and a commitment was the difference between compliance and belief, and she needed belief. She said, "If you see something in this diner that doesn't align with how we've said we're going to treat people, you tell me. Not AR, not a suggestion box, not after your shift. You tell me right then, and I will back you up every time." Sandra said, "Even if it's uncomfortable," Emma said, "especially if it's uncomfortable." David said, "And if it's me, if I'm the one doing the thing that's wrong." The room shifted. It was the question nobody had expected him to ask, which made it the most important question asked in the meeting. Emma looked at him directly. She said, "Then you tell me it's you, and we handle it the same way." David held her gaze. He said, "Okay." Emma said, "Okay." The meeting ended. People filed out toward the floor, the kitchen, the ordinary machinery of a diner morning. David was last, and he stopped at the door and turned back and said, "Emma, can I ask you something?" She said yes. He said, "That woman, the mother Becca told you about, the one who looked like she was expecting it." He paused. "Does she come back?" "Do you think she'll come back?" Emma looked at him. She said, "Not unless we give her a reason to." David said, "How do we give her a reason?" Emma said, "We be different, consistently, over time, and word gets around." She paused. "Word gets around in both directions, David. That's the whole lesson of Wednesday." He stood there for a second, absorbing that. Then he said, "Right," and went out to the floor. The weeks that followed were not seamless. Change never is. There were mornings when the old habits pushed back a moment of hesitation at the door, when someone unfamiliar walked in, a tension in the room that Emma had to consciously dissolve with a simple act of walking toward the person and greeting them first loudly enough for the room to hear. There were conversations with David that were difficult, where they sat across from each other with genuine disagreement between them about how to handle a specific situation and work through it the hard way with patience that was sometimes in short supply, and honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable, and the shared agreement that discomfort was not a reason to stop. But there were also the other moments, the moments that accumulated. The Thursday 3 weeks after the staff meeting, when Emma started what she called the community table, one large table pushed together from 4 smaller ones at the back of the diner open every Thursday morning to anyone who needed a meal and couldn't afford it. No announcement required, no paperwork, no proof of anything. You sat down and Sandra brought you coffee and you ate. The first Thursday, 2 people came. The second Thursday, 5. By the 6th Thursday, there were 14, and the regulars had started doing something Emma hadn't asked them to do, which was arriving early on Thursdays specifically so they could be in the room, so the community table didn't feel like a separate thing, but like part of the same room everyone was in. Gerald Hutchins came every Thursday. He had started coming to the regular Thursday morning, not just for his usual breakfast, but specifically for the community table, not to eat at it. He could afford his own breakfast, but to sit at the counter near it and talk to whoever sat down, because Gerald Hutchins was 71 years old and had lived in Silver Creek his whole life and knew more about this town than anyone currently running it. And it turned out that what some of the people at the community table needed almost as much as a meal was someone who remembered the same streets they'd grown up on. Emma watched this happen and did not direct it. She just kept the coffee coming. The call from Marcus came on a Friday afternoon, 5 weeks after Wednesday. She was doing inventory in the back when her phone rang, and she stepped outside to take it because Marcus's calls had a quality to them that deserved the respect of stepping outside. He said, "I want you to know something." She said, "What?" He said, "There's been a conversation happening among the people who were there Wednesday about what's been going on in Silver Creek since." Emma said, "What do you mean what's been going on?" Marcus said, "Word gets around, Emma. You said it yourself." A pause. "People have been hearing about the community table, about the staff meeting, about the changes you've made, and there are people in my world who want to be part of that." Emma said, "Part of it? How?" He said, "There's a veterans program. Informal, we've been doing it for a few years, mostly in Phoenix, connecting riders who are veterans with services they need, and sometimes just with each other, because isolation is one of the biggest things these men deal with, and nobody talks about it." He paused. "We'd like to expand it into Silver Creek. Use your Thursday space if you're willing. One Saturday a month morning, open to veterans in the area." Emma stood outside the diner in the November air, 6 weeks exactly since the morning. William Walker had walked through the door, and she said, "Yes, absolutely yes." Marcus said, "You didn't even ask about the details." She said, "I know enough." He said, and she could hear the smile in it, "Yeah, you do." The first Veterans Saturday happened 3 weeks later. 14 men came. 3 of them had not left their houses in a meaningful way in months. 2 of them had not talked about their service to anyone outside their immediate family in years. One of them, a 68-year-old man named Arthur, who had come in alone and sat at the end of the community table with his hands around his coffee cup, in the same way William Walker had held his water glass 6 weeks ago, said almost nothing for the first hour. And then Gerald Hutchins sat down next to him because Gerald Hutchins had radar for the person in the room who most needed someone to sit next to them. And Gerald said, "Where'd you serve?" And Arthur said, "Vietnam." And Gerald said, "My brother was in Vietnam." And Arthur looked at him and something shifted in his face and he started talking, and he did not stop for 45 minutes. Emma found out about that conversation from Sandra, who had been refilling cups nearby and had caught most of it. Sandra told her at the end of the shift quietly in the way you tell someone something that moved you when you're still not entirely sure you have the words for it. She said, I don't think that man has talked like that in a long time." Emma said, "No, probably not." Sandra said, "This is what you meant, isn't it? When you told Michael what the diner should be." Emma said, "Yes." Sandra looked at the room empty now. End of the day, chairs up on some of the tables, the overhead lights still humming their low note that nobody who worked there could hear anymore. She said, "I should have stood up for you 2 months ago, when it happened." Emma said, "Sandra, I know what you said," Sandra said. "I know, but I'm telling you anyway because I need you to know I understand it differently now. What it costs to stand up and what it costs not to." She looked at Emma. "I won't make that mistake again." Emma looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I know you won't." The Jake situation broke open on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the community table started, 7 weeks after the staff meeting, 9 weeks after the morning William Walker walked through the door. Emma was in Michael Bennett's office. She had started having bi-weekly meetings with Michael that were part operational review and part ongoing conversation about the larger changes which Michael engaged with the genuine interest of a man who had realized he'd been absentee from his own business in ways that mattered and was making up for lost time. They were in the middle of reviewing the community table numbers, how many people had used it, estimated cost impact on overall revenue, which had gone up, not down, because the community table had become something people in Silver Creek knew about and felt good about and made a point of supporting with their regular business when Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, intending to ignore it. It was Jake. She said, "Give me 1 second," and stepped out. Jake said, I got a call from Dr. Reyes's office." Emma went very still. Jake was seeing Dr. Reyes about the 3rd surgery, the one that had been pending for months, the one that was sitting in the surgery fund, that was still not fully covered, the one Emma had been rebuilding toward since losing 3 weeks of income from the firing. Dr. Reyes's office calling meant something had happened, and the only things that could happen were things that were better or things that were worse. She said, "Jake, what did they say?" He said, Jake. He said Marcus Reed called Dr. Reyes' office last week, apparently, and the Hells Angels there's a charitable foundation. I didn't know about it. Marcus apparently didn't bring it up on Wednesday because he didn't want it to feel like he didn't want you to feel Jake's voice was doing the thing it did when he was trying to be composed about something that was making composure difficult. The foundation covers medical costs for individuals who've done significant service to members of the community, and Marcus submitted your name, and they approved it. Emma put her hand against the wall of the hallway. She said, Jake, he said, the surgery is covered, Em. The whole thing. Dr. Reyes' office called to confirm the funding and to schedule. They said they can do it in January. Emma stood in the hallway outside Michael Bennett's office with her hand against the wall, and she did not say anything for what felt like a long time, but was probably 10 seconds. She was doing the thing she never let herself do in the middle of the workday, which was feel the full weight of something all at once, rather than in manageable pieces. But the wall was there and her hand was on it, and the weight arrived anyway. She said, is he serious? Jake said, the money is already in the account. Dr. Reyes confirmed it. She said, Jake? He said, I know. She said, He said, I know, Em, I know. She called Marcus from the parking lot because she needed air, and she needed to not be overheard, and she needed to have this conversation without anyone watching her face while she had it. He answered in 2 rings. She said, Marcus? He said, Emma. She said, you should have told me. He said, I know I didn't because I was afraid you'd tell me not to. She said, I would have. He said, I know. Emma stood in the parking lot with the December air cold against her face, and she said, Marcus, that's the amount Don't, he said gently but firmly. Don't do the math out loud with me. It's done. It's not a loan. It's not something you pay back. It's not something you owe anyone. The foundation exists for exactly this. A person who did something real at cost to themselves and needed something real in return. His voice was steady and warm. Let it be what it is. Emma said, I don't know how to do that. He said, I know you don't. That's why I didn't ask your permission first. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, how is William? Marcus said, he's doing better. He's been writing again. He asked about you last week. I told him about the community table and the Veterans Saturday, and he went quiet for a minute, and then he said, yeah, that tracks. Marcus paused. He said to tell you when the time was right, he said to tell you that what you did for him that Tuesday was the first time in months he felt like the world had something in it that wasn't grief, and that he wanted you to know that. Emma closed her eyes. She stood in the parking lot with her eyes closed, and she thought about a man walking into a diner with his brother 6 days gone, and his body hurting and his road running out underneath him, and a glass of water, and what a glass of water could mean to a person who was running and empty. She said, tell him I'm glad. Marcus said, I will. She said, and Marcus, thank you for all of it, for the calls and the Wednesday and the foundation and for seeing it. He said, thank you for giving us something to see. Jake's surgery was scheduled for January 14th. The weeks between the phone call and the surgery date had a quality that Emma had not experienced in a long time, which was the quality of forward motion without dread underneath it. She had spent 2 years in a constant low-level emergency, the bills and the fund, and the calculations and the next payment always at the edge of her awareness, a background frequency she'd become so accustomed to that she'd stopped noticing it the way she'd stopped noticing the hum of the overhead lights. And now the frequency was gone, and the absence of it felt strange and enormous, like a sound you only realize has been there when it stops. She channeled the energy into the diner. The community table expanded to 2 mornings a week. The Veterans Saturday had a wait list. Emma was in conversations with 2 organizations in the county about partnering on a job placement program for people in transition, veterans, people coming out of difficult circumstances, people who needed not just a meal, but a way back into something. Michael Bennett, who had been quietly transformed by the past 3 months into someone Emma was increasingly glad to work for, funded the first phase of the program out of the diner's operating budget without being asked. He announced it at a staff meeting, and Terry, who did not frequently show emotion at staff meetings, said, good on, with a finality that served as the group's response. David Collins was harder to track. He had been doing the work, Emma could see that. The hesitations had become less frequent. The calculation, that split-second pause before treating someone fully like a person, had shortened, noticeably not gone, but shortening, which was the honest version of change, the version that was actually change rather than performance. But there were moments when Emma caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read. And one afternoon in late December, she finally said directly, "What is it?" He looked up from the schedule he'd been making. He said, "What?" She said, "You've been there something you're not saying, and I'd rather you said it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm trying to figure out something." She said, "What?" He said, "Whether what I'm doing is actually change or whether it's just compliance with you. Because you're here now and you have authority and the consequences of not changing are different." He looked at her directly. "I want it to be real. I'm not sure yet if it is." Emma looked at him for a long moment. This was the most honest thing David Collins had said to her in 3 years, possibly in his life. And she understood that it had cost him something to say it and that the cost itself was data. She said, "The fact that you're asking the question means it's moving toward real." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because people who are only complying don't worry about whether they're only complying. They don't need it to be genuine. The fact that you need it to be genuine, that's the genuine part." David sat with that for a second. Then he said, "That might be the most frustrating thing anyone has ever said to me." Emma said, "Good. Frustration means you're paying attention." He looked at her. Then unexpectedly, he laughed, a short surprise sound like something that escaped before he could organize it. Emma felt the laugh as significant because it was the first time in 3 years she'd heard David Collins laugh in a way that wasn't about being right about something. January 14th came. Emma drove Jake to the surgical center at 5:30 in the morning. They didn't talk much in the car because Jake was doing what he did before big things, which was go quiet and still conserving something. And Emma drove and let the quiet be what it was, which was fine. Before he went in, he turned to her and said, "Go to work." She said, "Jake." "Em." He looked at her. "Go to work. There's nothing you can do in a waiting room for 6 hours that you can't do better at the diner. Go." A pause. "I'll call you when I'm out." She looked at her brother. She said, "You're going to be okay." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean it." He said, "I know you mean it. Go." She drove to the diner. She tied on her apron. She made coffee. She seated Gerald Hutchins at his regular stool and poured him his regular cup with 2 sugars, and the quiet understanding between them that today was not a regular day, and that Gerald, who understood more than he was generally credited for, would be at that stool all morning if Emma needed someone to look at who knew exactly who she was. At 9:15, Marcus Reed walked through the front door. Emma looked up from the counter and stopped moving. He was in a jacket, no vest, not the official presentation, but the person underneath it, and he walked to the counter and sat down and said, "How's the coffee?" She said, "Marcus, what are you doing here?" He said, "I was in the area." She said, "You live in Phoenix." He said, "I was in the area." He met her eyes. "How are you doing?" She said, "He's in surgery right now." He said, "I know. I talked to William this morning. He sends his best. He wanted to come, but he's up in Flagstaff dealing with some things his brother's estate is still sorting out." A pause. "He'll call you tonight." Emma said, "He doesn't have to do that." Marcus said, "He knows he doesn't have to." He accepted the cup she poured without being asked. "He wants to." She stood across the counter from him, and she thought about the shape of the past 3 months. She thought about a Tuesday morning that had started like every other Tuesday morning and had not ended like any morning she'd ever had. She thought about the legal pad and the numbers and the surgery fund and the $34 on her own tab. She thought about walking out of this diner with her jacket in her hands and getting in her car and sitting in the parking lot for exactly 3 seconds. She thought about Marcus calling her at 5 in the morning and 300 engines in the dark on the roads of Silver Creek and William Walker saying, "I walked in smaller than I'd ever felt, and I walked out feeling located." And Jake saying, "Kindness makes people want to keep going." And her mother saying it first years ago at a kitchen table, saying it the way you say things, to be true in your body long before you have the words. She said, "Marcus, can I ask you something I've been thinking about for 3 months?" He said, "Yes." She said, "If I hadn't done it, if I'd looked at William when he walked in and run the calculation and come to the same conclusion David did, and then somebody else had done what I did or nobody had, and William had just had a cup of coffee and left, would things have worked out for him anyway? Would he have been okay?" Marcus looked at her steadily for a long time. Then he said, "Probably, eventually. William is a strong man." Emma said, "So why does it matter? The thing I did, the water, the meal. The getting fired, if he would have been okay anyway, why did it matter? Marcus said, because eventually is a long way from Tuesday morning. He held his cup. Because a man who's lost his last family member and ridden until he ran out of road doesn't need eventually. He needs Tuesday morning. He looked at her. And because of the people who have been running on belief, who have been telling themselves for 32 years that someone out there still sees them, they don't need eventually either. They needed Wednesday. A pause. And because your brother needed January 14th, and he got it, and that's not eventually, that's now. Emma set down her coffee carafe. She stood very straight behind the counter of the Golden Road Diner in Silver Creek, Arizona, and she looked at Marcus Reed and she let everything he'd just said arrive completely all at once, without managing it or redirecting it toward the next task. She said, okay. He said, okay. She said, okay, I hear you. Jake's surgery finished at 11:47. Dr. Reyes called Emma at 12:03 to tell her that it had gone well better than expected. Actually, the structure of the repair cleaner than the pre-op imaging had suggested, the prognosis for mobility recovery improved from the estimate. Emma took the call in the parking lot, the same parking lot where she had called Marcus in December, standing in the same spot, and she listened to Dr. Reyes's voice deliver words that rearranged the future into a shape she had not fully allowed herself to imagine. She said thank you. She went back inside. She told Marcus. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, and when he opened them, they were steady and clear, and he said, good, that's good, Emma. She said, yeah. She picked up the carafe and went back to work because the diner was full and the coffee needed pouring, and the job did not pause for the things that mattered, and that was all right because Emma Carter had never needed the world to pause for her. She only needed to move through it with both eyes open. The months that followed built on each other the way good things build, not with fanfare, not with moments of dramatic revelation, but with the steady accumulation of days that were done right. The job placement program launched in February and placed its first 7 participants by March. The Veterans Saturday became Veterans Saturday and Wednesday. The community table became a fixture so central to the diner's identity that new customers often came in having heard about it first. Drawn not by the food, though the food remained excellent, Terry saw to that with the same 11-year ferocity, but by the idea of a place that was actually trying to be what it said it was. Michael Bennett hired a second assistant manager in April to handle the expansion of hours and the new programs, and when he told Emma, he said, you changed the math of this place. I want you to know I understand what that cost you first, and I don't take it lightly. Emma said, the math was always possible. It just needed different inputs. He smiled at that. He said, where did you get the certainty, that day you walked back out here with the apron? Emma thought about it. She said, I didn't have certainty. I had practice. I've been doing the right thing in small ways for a long time. That morning was just the same thing bigger. He said, most people can't hold it together at bigger. She said, I had 300 people outside reminding me what I was holding. William Walker came back through Silver Creek in March on his way somewhere else, the way he was always on his way somewhere else, and he came into the diner on a Tuesday morning, which neither of them had planned, but which felt when Emma looked up from the counter and saw him walk through the door like the only possible day for it. He was moving better. The compensation in his gait was less pronounced, the tightness in his face gone, and he looked. She searched for the word as he came to the counter. He looked located, which was his word, the word he'd used to Jake on that first Wednesday, and she was glad to see it in him, the quality of a man who knew where he was. He sat at the end of the counter, the same stool. She poured his water first before anything else because that was how it had started, and because some things deserved to be honored in the repeating. She set it in front of him, and he picked it up with both hands, and they looked at each other, and Emma felt the wholeness of the circle they were sitting inside. Not a neat circle, not a pretty one, but a real one drawn by real events. And closed now, or not, closed exactly, continued the way circles continue, curving back into themselves and forward into new ground simultaneously. He said, you look good. She said, you look better. He said, I am better. She said, Jake's doing physical therapy. They say he'll have full function back by summer. William said, that's the best thing you've told me. She said, pecans on today. He said, I was counting on it. She put in the order. She moved down the counter to take care of the other customers, the regulars and the newcomers, and the man she didn't recognize who had driven in off the highway and was looking at the room, the way strangers looked at rooms, assessing, welcome, calculating, and Emma moved toward him before he had time to finish the calculation, before he had time to decide, because that was what she did. That was who she was. It was not a policy or a decision. It was simply her. Moving toward people, giving them water before they asked for it, making them feel located in a world that had a way of making people feel lost. She seated the stranger. She poured his water. She said, "What can I get you?" And behind her at the end of the counter, William Walker watched and said nothing, and felt for the second time in his life in this particular diner exactly what he had felt the first time that he was sitting in the presence of something rare, something that did not calculate itself before it moved, something that simply moved toward people and meant it. Jake came back full-time in June. He didn't come back to the diner. He had his own plans, his own work. He'd been building toward during the recovery, taking classes online, developing skills. He'd been too exhausted to develop when all of their energy had been going towards survival. He came back to himself, which was what Emma had really been working toward all along. She realized not just the surgery, not just the bills, but the larger thing. The restoration of her brother to a life that was his own, rather than a life shaped entirely by what the scaffold had taken from him. He came into the diner on his first day back on both legs the way Emma could see was going to be possible again. Walking without the compensation, without the careful management of the unreliable leg. Walking the way he had walked before. And Emma was behind the counter, and she watched him come through the door, and she did not cry because she had promised herself she was done with that, but she held the counter with one hand for a second, just long enough to let the realness of it arrive. Gerald Hutchins at his regular stool looked at Jake walking in and then looked at Emma and said, "There it is," the way he said things he'd been waiting a long time to see. Emma said, "Yeah, Gerald, there it is." Jake sat down at the counter. He said, "Coffee?" She poured it. 2 sugars because he took it the same way as Gerald, and she knew it without asking. She knew everyone's coffee without asking. It was just what she did. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at her over the rim and said, "How are you doing?" She said, "I'm good." He said, "Really good or diner good?" She said, "Really good. Actually, genuinely really good." He believed her because he knew her face and he knew the difference. She moved down the counter. She had a room to run tables, to turn coffee, to pour people, to seat the 1,000 small things that added up to the one large thing. She moved through the Golden Road Diner on a Tuesday morning in June with the particular ease of someone who had found the place where their nature and their work were the same thing, and the room moved with her the way good rooms move with the people who understand them. Outside Silver Creek was ordinary. That was the thing that nobody who hadn't lived it would fully understand, the ordinariness of the aftermath. No monument, no ceremony, no marker on the road where things changed. Just a diner that was doing what a diner should do, which was feed people and make them feel human. And a woman who had always known how to do that and now had the authority to build it into something that outlasted any single morning. William Walker called that evening the way Marcus had said he would. Emma was at the kitchen table, not the legal pad this time. The notebook, the one she'd bought for the new thing, now filled almost to the last page with the architecture of everything that had been built. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "Emma." She said, "William." He said, "How was today?" She said, "Oh, good." Jake came in. He said, "I know, Marcus told me." "How did he look?" She said, "He looked like himself." William was quiet for a second. Then he said, "That's the best possible answer." She said, "Yeah." He said, "I've been thinking about something I wanted to say to you the right way, so I waited until I had the words." She said, "Okay." He said, "What you did that Tuesday, I know you keep saying it was just what you do. I know you keep saying it wasn't a decision, it was just what you do. And I believe you. I believe that's true." A pause. "But I want you to understand something. The things that change the world, the real things, the things that actually move something, they're almost never decisions. They're almost never the big dramatic choice. They're the accumulation of small things done consistently by people who don't know anyone is watching." He said, "You didn't know I was watching. You didn't know Marcus was going to have a call. You didn't know 300 people were going to show up. You just walked toward me. You just moved toward a person." Emma said, "Yes." He said, "That's the thing, Emma. That's the whole thing. Not the 300 people, not the foundation, not the community table. The thing is you walking toward me. The rest of it is just what happens when someone does the thing." Emma sat at her kitchen table in the house she shared with her brother, and she held the phone and she looked out the window at the ordinary June evening in Silver Creek, Arizona, and she thought about a Tuesday morning and a glass of water and the specific distance between a counter and a door and what it had taken to cross it. Not much. Not much at all. Just the decision. No, not even a decision. Just the movement, just the body going in the direction of the person who needed something. Because that was who she was. That was who she had always been, and the world had come back toward her in a shape she could never have imagined, because she had never imagined it. She had only done the thing. She said, "William." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you for stopping in Silver Creek." He said, "Thank you for making it worth stopping." She said goodnight. She set the phone down. She looked at the last page of the notebook, still half blank, still waiting. She picked up her pen. There was more to build. There always would be. And Emma Carter, 25 years old, a waitress who had become something else without ever stopping being a waitress. A woman who moved toward people instead of away from them, and had discovered that the world, given enough reason to believe in itself, moved back, picked up her pen, and got to work. Because that was the truth that one glass of water had proven, and 300 engines had carried across 4 states in a room full of people on a Wednesday morning in November had made visible for anyone willing to see it. Kindness is not a small thing dressed up in small clothes. Kindness is the most powerful force that ordinary people have access to. It travels farther than cruelty outlasts every calculation made against it and returns always. Always returns in forms larger than the hand that first set it moving. Emma Carter had set something moving with a glass of water, and what came back was a life.